Imagine an island country, small, without its own natural resources. Everything it needs, oil, iron, rubber, coal, has to be imported. Now imagine this country having grown enormously. Its population tripled in just a few decades. Its factories need more raw materials than ever before. Its army is growing. Its ambitions are growing, but its food security does not exist. An economic embargo and you collapse. This was Japan in 1941. Decades before, in the late 1800s, Japan had gone through extraordinary transformation. It emerged from an isolated medieval society and became a modern industrial power in just a few generations. But this industrialization required resources, many resources that Japan did not have. So Japan began to expand, first Manchuria, then parts of China. Each conquered territory had something that Japan needed: ore, food, space for growth. The military leaders believed that expansion was not aggression, it was survival. But the Western world did not see it that way, especially the United States. The Americans were angry with Japan invading China, so they imposed an embargo: no American oil, no American iron, no access to American ports. Japan was suddenly being economically strangled. Japanese generals and admirals had urgent conversations. The situation was unsustainable. Japan had perhaps 2 years of stockpiled oil. After that, the industrial machine would stop. The army would stop. The entire nation would collapse. There were only 2 options. First, yield to the Americans, remove troops from China, accept humiliation, allow Japan to be weaker. Second, fight. If they had to fight, there was a third path: Southeast Asia. Holland, Britain, France owned colonies that had everything Japan needed: rubber from Malaya, oil from Indonesia, food from all the islands. If Japan could conquer Southeast Asia, it would have resource security for a generation. But there was a monumental obstacle. The American Navy was stationed at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Pacific Fleet. 7 battleships, many cruisers, dozens of destroyers, hundreds of aircraft. If Japan attacked Southeast Asia, the USA would attack back. The USA would destroy the Japanese invasion. Game over. Unless Japan attacked Pearl Harbor first, destroyed the American Pacific Fleet before it had a chance to react. Then Japan would have a few months, maybe even a year, enough time to conquer all of Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter so strong that the Americans could not attack back without unbearable cost. And with conquered resources, Japan could build armaments to negotiate peace with the USA. War would not be necessary. Negotiation would be possible. It was audacious. It was risky. But for Japanese military leaders, it seemed to be the only path that did not lead to collapse. In January 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, began to plan. He was officially opposed to war with America. But his superiors had decided. So Yamamoto would plan the attack that had the best chance of working. Surprise attack. Aircraft carriers instead of battleships. Aircraft instead of cannons. Speed and surprise instead of traditional battle. Months of planning, simulations, routes plotted, pilots trained. Everything kept secret within the deepest structures of military command. Not even diplomats knew. Not even cabinet ministers had complete information. Only military leadership knew the real plan. November 1941. Japanese task force, 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers plus supply ships, leaves Japan in absolute secrecy. Crosses the North Pacific where American patrols were less dense. Radios turned off, no communication with Japan for weeks. If discovered, the attack was compromised. Crew knew, pilots knew, nobody could know they were coming. It was all or nothing. At Pearl Harbor, American soldiers sleep in bunks. Ships are anchored in routine formations. Aircraft are parked in rows. Nobody expected an attack. Why? Because war with Japan seemed distant, theoretically possible, but not imminent. Not on a Sunday morning. December 7th, 1941. Sunday. Dawn in Hawaii. Still night in Japan. Japanese task force is a few hundred kilometers from Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto gives final order. Pilots are called for briefing. 283 aircraft are on the decks of aircraft carriers, bombers, fighters, torpedo bombers. Each pilot receives a map of Pearl Harbor, aerial photograph, instructions, USS Arizona, USS West Virginia, USS Oklahoma. These are the targets. Destroy these ships. The American Pacific Fleet will be eliminated. Pilots know this is not an exercise. This is real war. Some were veterans from China, others young with just a few hundred hours of flight time. All were nervous. All knew they were participating in a moment that would change history. First wave of aircraft takes off at 6 in the morning Hawaii time. 183 aircraft, tight formation, flight in silence through darkness. Below them, dark ocean. Ahead of them, Pearl Harbor still sleeping. Nobody knows they are coming. Pilots get a view of Pearl Harbor as dawn begins. Blue water. Ships in perfect formation. Like an image from a military strategy book. Perfect target. One pilot said later that it looked like a massacre, not a battle. There was so little defense that it was almost dishonest. 7:55 in the morning, first bomb falls. In seconds, the sky above Pearl Harbor explodes in fire. Alarms ring. American soldiers wake up confused. What is happening? Exercise? No, this is real. USS Arizona is hit directly. 8 torpedoes, several bombs. Entire ship explodes in fire. 1,100 sailors trapped in that ship are killed in seconds. Only a few manage to get out. Majority are trapped. Entire ship disappears from within the water. Other ships are hit. USS West Virginia receives torpedoes. USS Oklahoma turns upside down. USS California is bombed. Ships sink. Ships catch fire. Black smoke rises to the sky. Men jump from burning water. Some never reach the surface. Some swim in water covered with burning oil. American aircraft are parked in rows. Easy target. Japanese pilots fire. Aircraft explode on the ground. None manage to take off for defense. American air defense tries to respond but is disorganized. Many anti-aircraft batteries are operated by men who never had to fire in real combat. Some manage to hit. Some Japanese aircraft fall, but not many, not enough. 30 minutes. First wave of attack causes devastation beyond what was planned. Ships sink, hundreds of men killed, military installations destroyed, but Japan planned a second wave. Another 100 aircraft take off, another hour of bombing, more destruction, more fire, more death. American soldiers are now organized. Anti-aircraft defense is responding better. Some Japanese aircraft are being shot down. Some Americans manage to run to defensive positions, but it is too late. Damage has already been done. 2 hours and 2 minutes. Attack ends. Japanese aircraft return to aircraft carriers. Task force withdraws, leaves behind 7 battleships destroyed or damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 1 destroyer sunk, 280 American aircraft destroyed or damaged, 1,203 soldiers killed. Wounded count in thousands. Cost for Japan, 29 aircraft lost, 55 pilots killed, 1 submarine carrier lost, practically nothing in comparison. Pilots who return to aircraft carriers are in a state of shock, complete success, but also complete knowledge that they did something irrevocable, that they crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Admiral Yamamoto supposedly receives news of complete success and supposedly says, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve." He knew about American factories, he knew about industrial capacity, he knew that tactical victory was not strategic victory, but orders had already been given. Task force returns to Japan. News of success reaches Tokyo, celebration. Radios shout news, people cry out with joy. Finally, they said that Japan defeated America. Finally, that the West would be forced to respect Japan. Nobody knew yet, nobody yet understood that on that Sunday morning, the entire world changed. Days after Pearl Harbor, a message arrived at the American Congress. President Franklin Roosevelt gave a speech. December 7th, 1941, would be a date which will live in infamy. Congress voted. Vote was almost unanimous. America declared war on Japan. A nation that had been divided, many Americans wanted to stay out of the European war, was suddenly united. Fury was universal. Anger was absolute. Japan had attacked American soil, had killed unarmed American soldiers, had insulted a nation that believed in its own power. The American machine turned around. Factories that had been making consumer goods began making weapons. Aircraft production accelerated. Battleships were built at a pace that Japan could not imagine. Abundant resources, abundant labor, abundant technology. American industrial capacity was an almost mythical thing. Japan could produce 5,000 aircraft in 1 year. America would produce 50,000. Japan believed it would have a few months, maybe a year. Enough time to conquer everything it needed. But the months began to pass and reality became obvious. Japan's initial victory at Pearl Harbor did not lead to negotiations. It led to total mobilization. America was not wounded and ready to negotiate. America was furious and determined to destroy. First 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan won many battles, conquered the Philippines, conquered Malaya, conquered Indonesia, conquered Thailand, expanded empire in extraordinary fashion. But while conquests were happening, the American fleet was rebuilding. New ships were being commissioned. New pilots were being trained. In May 1942, Battle of the Coral Sea. First time a naval battle was fought without ships ever seeing each other. Aircraft carriers on one side of the ocean attacking aircraft carriers on the other side through aircraft. Japan lost one aircraft carrier, America lost one aircraft carrier. Technically, it was a draw. Strategically, it was a turning point. 1 month later, Battle of Midway. This was the real breaking point. Japan planned a trap. It would use some aircraft carriers as bait. America would send aircraft carriers to attack. Japan would destroy American aircraft carriers. Fleet would be eliminated again. Victory would be total. But there was a problem. America had broken the Japanese military code. America knew the plan. America was waiting. When Japanese pilots attacked, American pilots were already descending. Furious combat. In a few hours, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk. Thousands of pilots, sailors, crew died. Japan would never recover from Midway. There were not enough aircraft carriers to replace those lost. There were not enough veteran pilots. There were not enough resources. From Midway onward, Japan was on the defensive. Battle after battle, position after position was lost. Islands that had been conquered easily were now being conquered back by America, with extreme difficulty. And on the home front, reality began to impose itself. American bombings on Japanese cities began. Not on a large scale at first, but Tokyo was bombed, Osaka was bombed, Kobe was bombed, houses were destroyed, civilians were killed, women, children, elderly. Those who had celebrated victory at Pearl Harbor now trembled when they heard bombing sirens. Japanese government began recruiting more pilots, but the training pilots received was inadequate. Veterans from China, veterans from Midway, had died. Replacements had no experience. They were sent on missions against American pilots who had hundreds of hours in real combat. Result was predictable. Young Japanese pilots were shot down in devastating numbers. War material began to become scarce. There was not enough steel. There was not enough aluminum, there was not enough fuel. Factories that should be producing weapons in massive quantity were being bombed. Supply lines were being cut. America had an island hopping strategy, jumping from island to island, leaving others behind, but slowly surrounding Japan. Japanese soldiers on distant islands began to understand that they would have to die defending. No rescue was coming, no reinforcements were coming. There was only waiting for death or capture. And Japanese military culture said that capture was worse than death. In 1943, someone finally expressed what everyone knew privately. General Hideki Tojo, who had been Prime Minister and had led the invasion of China, was finally removed from power. Not because he had asked, but because the military situation had become intolerable. Even so, there was no real alternative. Continuing to fight was the only path that the authoritarian military regime knew. Military and political leaders wanted to negotiate, but America said, only unconditional surrender. Accept complete defeat. Emperor will be judged. Government will be dissolved. Japan will be occupied. Japan will be controlled by America. Nothing less than this. For leaders who had created a great empire, the prospect was intolerable. But the alternative was complete destruction. And destruction is exactly what was coming. 1943. Japan was in a long war against two giants, America in the Pacific. Soviet Union after Japan attacked Manchuria. Resources for war were becoming more scarce each month. Fuel was rationed. Food was rationed. Metal was rationed. Everything was for war. Nothing was for the people. Military strategy became more desperate. In 1944, military leaders introduced a tactic they called kamikaze. Pilots would fly their aircraft directly into American ships. Explosive load, no return, certain death. But each attack could damage or destroy an American ship. Pilots were mostly volunteers, but volunteers is a word that needs context. Military culture demanded honorable death instead of living in defeat. Pilots who refused were seen as cowards. So many volunteers were actually men who chose death before dishonor, or young men who were socially coerced. Letters left by kamikaze pilots that survived show people trapped between loyalty and despair. Some wrote that they were dying to save Japan. Others wrote that they knew Japan was losing and that their death would make no difference. Some wrote about missing home, about mothers they would never see again, about girlfriends who would not marry. Everything sacrificed for bravery that had no real military purpose. Battles continued. Iwo Jima in February 1945, small island. Japan defended every rock, every inch. Combat was fierce. Many Americans died, but Japan lost much more. Soldiers without enough supply, without enough hope, only loyalty, fear, and despair. Okinawa in March 1945. This was even more terrible because Okinawa had a large civilian population. Civilians were caught in the middle of combat, or were instructed by military to throw themselves off cliffs instead of surrendering. Mass suicides, entire families dying together, images that traumatized an entire generation of American soldiers. Japanese cities continued being bombed. Tokyo was devastated in incendiary bombing in March 1945. Entire night of fire. 90,000 people died in one night. Majority were civilians. Entire families disappeared. Entire cities were turned to ashes. Japan knew that invasion of home islands was coming. America was preparing. The invasion would be in September 1945. Japan was preparing for fanatical defense. Government told the people that it was better to die defending than to live under foreign occupation. But before invasion, there was something else. Something that Japan could not defend against. August 1945, solitary American aviator flies over Hiroshima, carries a bomb that had been developed in secret, bomb that had cost billions of dollars, bomb that had power that nobody had seen before. Atomic bomb. He drops it. When it exploded, this was not conventional bombing. This was end of world in microcosm. Flash of light, heat of millions of degrees, shockwave. Everything disappeared. 70,000 people died instantly in Hiroshima. Within weeks, the number rose to 140,000 when radiation continued killing. 3 days later, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. 40,000 people died instantly. The world had entered the nuclear age. Japan suddenly understood that continuing to fight meant total annihilation, not military defeat, annihilation. Government decided to surrender, but how to surrender? How to admit total defeat? Emperor Hirohito recorded a radio message. First time the people had heard his voice in decades. He said that Japan was surrendering, that war had ended. Soldiers and civilians listened in shock. Some cried, some were furious, some were relieved. The war had ended, the nightmare had ended, but not really. For many, the nightmare continued. American military occupation began. Entire social structure was dismantled. Zaibatsus, conglomerates that controlled the economy, were broken up. Land was redistributed. Government was rewritten. Emperor, who had been worshipped as a god, was declared to be only human. Japanese soldiers on distant islands continued fighting because they did not know the war had ended. Some continued fighting for months, some for years. One soldier did not learn of the surrender until decades later. Lived isolated on an island, not knowing that the world had changed. Civilians who survived bombings had permanent burns, permanent scars, permanent trauma. Children were orphaned, women widowed. Men returned from war without arms, without legs, with minds destroyed by everything they had seen. Japan, which had believed it was fighting for survival, had destroyed itself. From a nation that was a rising power in 1941, Japan became a completely occupied, completely defeated nation. Currency had no value, food was rationed, houses did not exist, everything had to be rebuilt. The Japanese perspective of December 7th, 1941 is not a story of villains heroically being punished. It is a story of military leadership that made a calculation that seemed rational at the time: conquer quickly, gain resources, force peace through tactical victory. The plan made sense on paper, made sense in the planning room, but it had not counted on one thing: the will of a nation of 300 million people. The industrial capacity of a nation that had more factories than Japan had people. The determination of a people who had been attacked in a cowardly manner in peacetime. Pilots who flew over Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, lived lives marked by that day. Some became celebrated veterans. Some could never live with what they had done. Some wrote memoirs. Some never spoke about it ever. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the attack, died in 1943, shot down by American fighters. His last thoughts are not known, but many believe he died knowing that his fears had come true, that awakening the giant had proven to be exactly what he feared. The lesson that Japan learned, that many people learned, is that tactical victory does not guarantee strategic victory, that surprising an enemy does not mean defeating them, that industrial capacity, population, will of people count more than any initial attack. Japan began war because it believed it had no choice, ended war having lost everything. 2 million Japanese soldiers dead, millions of civilians dead, cities destroyed, nation occupied. It was the price that Japan paid for awakening a sleeping giant.